Oh no!
Go.
Hi there, we're here with Robert Peston, host of Peston on Sunday and also the political editor for ITV News. Robert, thank you for giving us your time.
Pleasure to be with you, Vincent.
Yeah, so we're talking about your new book. It's called WTF.
Yeah,
and
it's too early in the afternoon to tell people what that stands for.
Right, exactly. But I actually want to start by reading a passage out.
Please.
And from your introduction, actually. You write, "I didn't vote for Brexit, and I would never have voted for Trump. But I now fear that those who did were on the right side of an important argument and the right side of history." What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that millions of people on lower incomes, this country, much of Europe, in America, have seen their incomes stagnate, in many cases fall over many years, and right now nobody, for some time, nobody in the establishment, nobody running these countries has given them any hope that things would get better. And these votes were, I would argue, their last opportunity to give the establishment the kind of kicking it needed to start the process of thinking hard about how we make the economy work, not just for privileged people like me, but make the economy work for everybody.
Right, and so part of the reason why you wrote this book was as a response to the events that has happened in the past year that we all know about, such as Brexit, Trump, and you also talk about Jeremy Corbyn and the
Corbyn surge,
the Corbyn surge, and also Macron in France.
So let's be absolutely clear: different groups of people obviously voted, for the people who voted for Trump, in a sort of socio-economic, demographic sense, were not the same people who voted for Corbyn, but they were different groups of people who were very, very angry that they were being ignored. And so they are part of a sort of wider, I have to say, slightly complicated phenomenon of millions of different people feeling ignored and frustrated for a variety of reasons. Now, what I'd say is there is a sort of spectrum of causes of what I think of as a people's revolt. And what I try and do in the book is analyse that spectrum, identify where there are overlaps between, for example, the young middle-class people who voted for Corbyn and the older working-class people who voted for Brexit. And there are some things that they have in common, notably that the way the economy in this country has run has ignored their interests for some considerable time.
Right, so when you say the right side of history, you don't necessarily mean that the decision to leave the EU was the right decision to make.
No, I would, in many sense, look, in a conventional economic sense, it looks like an irrational decision because, my own view is, and I said this throughout the campaign, that the weight of argument suggests that leaving the EU will make the UK poorer. None of us can know what the UK's prospects or economy will look like in 30 years, but certainly over any meaningful forecasting horizon, let's say 10 to 15 years, very hard to see how the UK can be anything but poorer as a result of Brexit over that kind of timescale. Not devastatingly poorer, but poorer. So you would argue that Brexit in that sense was irrational from an economic sense. But but the status quo for millions of people was equally irrational. So what I'm saying is, in a way, this is the most magnificent, huge example of gesture politics. That you are you've got millions of people in this country, quite a lot of people who voted for Brexit hadn't voted, in some cases, ever. They were so disillusioned with the political system. This was their opportunity to say to the likes of Blair, Brown, and to, who were in power at the time, Osborne and Cameron, you weren't listening to us. Our interests have been ignored for too long, and we're going to give you a good kicking in the hope that that we are at last listened to, and that this place is run at last in a way that takes account of us. And to be clear, as I say, I don't think that was an irrational decision by them, and I also don't think it was irrational to listen to what Cameron and Osborne said, which was, for example, if you vote for Brexit, house prices are going to collapse. It's one of the things that Osborne said. Well, as it happens, house prices haven't yet collapsed, but even if they had collapsed, millions of people who voted for Brexit didn't own houses. So that what kind of a threat? They'd love to own a house, but what kind of a threat was that? In fact, if you're if you're somebody on a lowish income, a collapse in house prices you might think was a rather good thing. It might give you a better opportunity to actually get on the housing ladder.
Right. And so that's actually a big theme in your book, which is the idea that a significant portion of British society don't understand a lot of the sentiments that people who voted for Brexit, the sentiments that they have about how the economy is working.
Yeah, I mean, I was, one of the things I say in the book is one of the things that I am somebody who, my entire professional life I have tried to understand, the countries within I've worked and the people that I'm trying to communicate with. And one of the things I did find genuinely shocking, and I say in the book, I think I felt ashamed of this, that if I look at my very, very wide circle of friends and acquaintances, almost none of them voted to leave the European Union. And it did persuade me, to use that awful cliche, that I do live in this sort of bubble or ghetto of rather privileged, spoiled people, right, who are too out of touch with what millions of people were feeling.
Right. I do want to read out the passage that you mentioned, which is, "It turns out I have not really been living in the United Kingdom, but in a privileged metropolitan bubble or ghetto." And I think we're here at the LSE, and I think that many students share this sentiment. Right. So I think many students would think, yeah, that does apply to me as well. That I'm living, all these students around me, all my friends, they all were pro-European and anti-Brexit. And I think the idea that actually we are just living in our bubble, that can shock a lot of us. But then, if I had to push back on you a bit on this,
yeah, please,
wouldn't you say that this problem is really just the problem of attitudes, of a dialogue? Whereas, as you say, you don't dispute the fact that the economic argument is that Brexit hurts the UK economy. And who does that hurt the most? Well, the poorest, less privileged people of Britain. So maybe someone would say, well, even if I wasn't as privileged as I was, and I'm not living in this bubble, I still wouldn't advocate for Brexit.
Well, I raise the question whether we would have a government, for example, belatedly talking about reform of planning laws, biggish house building programme. Would you have, in my view, you would not have had the Corbyn surge, frankly, had it not been for that Brexit vote. I mean, we might well see, a Corbyn government which would be the most left-wing government, potentially in British history, as it were. And that again, I would argue, is a direct response to the Brexit vote. Now, as it happens, quite a lot of people who voted for Corbyn because they hate the idea of Brexit. But there is still a causal link there, and whether the links that get us to a place where poorer people's interests are at last being focused on, whether that is a sort of direct or indirect effect of Brexit, it is undoubtedly an effect of Brexit.
And so on the subject of inequality, the elites versus the ordinary people, today is obviously the day after the Paradise Papers revelations yesterday. Yeah. As a seasoned journalist yourself, and as a budding journalist here, can you tell us, how big do you think this story will be? Because really yesterday was only the opening salvo of revelations, really.
So, when it comes to the disclosure of people and institutions who are registered in these tax havens, it is plainly going to be deeply humiliating for a number of individuals who have deliberately used, and indeed companies, who have deliberately used these tax havens to avoid, in some cases it may be evade in an illegal way tax, but certainly to avoid tax. Now, all that does is reinforce one of the great themes in the book, of course, which is to do with the way that trends over the last few years have widened the gap between rich and poor. It'll increase anger. I think, however, that there is a degree of misunderstanding about some of the purposes to which these tax havens are used. And I'm not in any sense trying to, sort of in a sense say, the royal family shouldn't be criticised at all for the fact that some of their assets were held offshore in this way. But what I would say is, and in particular, I think the thing which is particularly embarrassing for the royal family is that some of their money was invested in a particular company in this way, which is a company that is widely seen as charging ludicrously high, effectively, interest rates to poor people who can't afford to buy the things they want to buy. And that is humiliating for the royal family. But it should be remembered that vast numbers of conventional pension fund managers, asset managers, register themselves in these tax havens, not to protect their clients from tax, but to protect themselves, the limited partnerships, from tax. And millions and millions of people would, in that indirect sense, like the royal family, find themselves beneficiaries of fund management companies, asset management companies that are registered in these places without remotely knowing, right? So it turns out that the Shadow Chancellor has a pension fund, has a pension where the pension fund manager happens to have registered or to have got funds invested in a vehicle that is registered in a tax haven. Now, John MacDonald presumably didn't know that was the case because he's just a sort of passive member of the pension fund. But you could run the argument that he's benefiting from a tax haven. And so I think, you've got to be slightly careful when you're looking at a case, like the Paradise supposed scandal, as it were, differentiating those people who have set out, or those companies that have set out systematically to avoid tax, and I think that is something that they will face legitimate criticism for, and other people who just happen to have a bit of savings in a vehicle, and it's the vehicle itself which has taken advantage of these structures without telling their clients.
Right, so from a journalistic perspective, would you say that, well, based on what you said, would you say that, do you agree with the kind of coverage that we get about the Panama Papers last year, now the Paradise Papers, how it seems like it's almost like the idea is, as long as it's out there, we'll let the public decide whether they're guilty or not?
So I think there is an obligation on journalists to be, perhaps a little bit more sophisticated in the way that they explain what's happened. There is a sort of, I think if I were, Her Majesty the Queen, and doubt that that's going to happen one day. I'm bound to be Her Majesty the Queen one day. No, but if I were Her Majesty the Queen and I took a close interest in the way that this story has been covered, I might feel, slightly uneasy that, that her investments, which I don't think she had any involvement in making, and indeed her advisors may not have known the extent to which the money was in a vehicle that was registered in a tax haven, where she's being lumped in with individuals who, with their eyes open, put their money in tax havens to avoid tax. It's a slightly, I'm not trying to say the royal family didn't make a mistake in not checking where their money was, but I can sort of see how broadly by accident they ended up there in a way that is plainly not the case with other people who use these tax havens. And all I'm really saying is that I think as journalists who are reporting on this story, it's quite important to, try and make judgments about who is going out of their way in a very deliberate way to avoid tax, and those who, in a sense, have ended up in this tax haven by accident.
Okay, so
because it does happen, because you can accident. As I say, if you happen to have money, there'll be people who are watching this who either themselves or their parents may have money in a pension fund and not have the faintest idea that the pension fund is invested in asset managers that happen to be registered in these places. But if you're the recipient of the pension, you are benefiting from that, but you would have no idea that you are.
Right. So let's go back to your book. So you start the book by writing a letter to your dad, who I understand was actually an LSE graduate.
He was an LSE graduate. He was a teacher here. I mean, he spent his formative years at the. I don't know. There's a very distinguished economist of the last century called Lord Robbins, whose name I imagine is on some of the buildings here.
Yeah, we have a lecture series.
And so he. Although my dad was well to the left of Lionel Robbins, nonetheless he was sort of Lionel Robbins' disciple, and so there was a close association between the sort of formative years in an intellectual sense of my dad and the LSE.
Mm-hmm. So why was it important for you to start your book by essentially writing a letter to him?
Because the world has turned out very differently from the way he and I expected it. I mean, for example, in the case of Brexit, we always would have assumed that economic arguments win the day, and they didn't. Right now, he died in April of 2016. We got the Brexit vote in June. We got Trump in November. We got the Corbyn surge the next year. He wasn't alive to see any of these tremendous events. And because he was somebody who was also, a very much sort of formative influence on the way I think, I regretted, because I love my dad deeply, not being able to talk to him about these big events. We talked about two things, Arsenal and politics. Obviously, talking about Arsenal Football Club at the moment is a very depressing experience. So, talking about politics is a pretty depressing experience. And so, but I just thought, a way of sort of working out what I thought about all of this was to imagine the kind of conversation I would have with him.
Right, and you also end the book with letter to your dad.
So I begin the book, as you know, with an analysis of what went wrong, and then I end the book with some ideas about how to fix this. So I am somebody who now thinks we have to have a wealth tax, because I think so much of the wealth that people have accumulated is effectively a windfall for happening to have been able to climb on the housing ladder at the right time, if you're my generation. I've got a proposal for how you have a wealth tax where the tax is not paid in cash but it's rolled up and you pay it either when you sell the property or actually I think probably when you die. There are proposals for regional income taxes because I think one of the great scandals is the productivity and income disparities between, for example, areas like the northeast and the southeast, or different parts of America, different parts of France. And so I think there must be a way of tailoring the provision and the cost of finance much more to local conditions. There are proposals for how you would oblige, at a time of stagnating incomes, there are proposals for how you would oblige companies to share more of their profits with workers. There's a whole variety of different ideas for how we broadly build an economy that people would perceive to be fairer.
Right. So my final question for you, after all these proposals that you talked about, and it's all detailed in this book, are you optimistic about all of these things? I mean, your book title is WTF. Are you optimistic that in 10 years you'll write a book with maybe LOL or something else that's a bit happier?
Not sure LOL is necessarily a happier ending. So let's not go there. So look, I am somebody who, although I have often been accused of being very gloomy, warning people that the crash was coming and banks were going bust, people accused me of trying to sort of, destroy capitalism, which is completely bad. And now I'm warning about quite how fragile our political systems are. Nonetheless, I'm not a pessimist. I mean, I think, in the rich West we have enormous advantages. We have brilliantly talented people. What I'm basically saying here is we have to confront these problems not in a spirit of denial, somehow thinking that Brexit will turn out for the best. Brexit will not turn out for the best unless we think very hard and rigorously about what kind of economy we need to have to cope with Brexit. I am broadly optimistic that we are a rational people and we will get there in the end. But I am equally of the view that there is a huge challenge ahead, and the more that we pretend that there isn't, the more likely it won't have a happy ending. As I say, I am one of the world's great optimists, and I think ultimately we'll be all right. But it's going to be a struggle.
Thank you. Well, the book is WTF. I highly
Available now!
Available now in all good bookstores. Robert, thank you so much for your time.
Lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you.